In these times of uncertainty, it's all the more important that we keep collaborating, informing, and inspiring each other, so that we can be smarter and better tomorrow. Welcome to the Pakhuis de Zwijger livecast.
Good morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Welcome to the 9th edition of Emerging Stories, Journalism in Times of Isolation. I'm Kadir van Lohuizen, I'm your host, and we will have three great guests today. You can find us on Zoom, or you can or you can go to the website of dezwijger.nl, and via Zoom you can chat with the guests, and you can ask questions as well. Please address to which guest you ask your question. We're also on Instagram Live. I'll get to my three guests. Today, live in the studio, we have Erik Smit. He's the co-founder and editor-in-chief of Follow the Money. We will have Silke Grunwald from Zurich speaking to us via Zoom. She's a freelance reporter. And we will have Nicholas Jackson from, he's based in Berlin, but he's a British author, journalist, and investigator. Today we will be specifically talking about what governments, the European Central Bank, etc., is doing for their different countries, and especially talking about government support for companies and multinationals and what happens with the tax system. So we'll start off with Erik. Very happy you're here.
Well, thank you.
We're in Amsterdam, so let's start just around the corner, because it's only a few steps from here that Booking.com is building their new head office, which is going to be enormous.
Huge headquarters, yeah. It's a multi-billion-dollar company. You know, that before the crisis started, had a market cap of almost $60 billion.
Because they are originally Dutch, right?
Yeah. As a matter of fact, my wife worked for them back in the day. Before she didn't get any shares, otherwise.
Yeah. And Follow the Money did publish a big article about the government, the support Booking.com has been asking from the Dutch government.
Yeah, that article.
Could you tell us a little bit what's wrong with that?
The article gained some traction. It was about basically Booking.com holding up its hand at the government and asking for support, whereas that same company bought its own shares the year before for some $14 billion. With that transaction, it sort of gave that money back to its shareholders. $14 billion is a huge amount of money.
So, which means that in their annual results, they had a negative.
Well, they had to actually borrow money to do that. So they had, and it made their company less resilient in times of trouble. And as it's normal with very sharply financed companies like Booking, they aggressively finance. They like to pay out lots of money to their shareholders, and that's what happened here. As soon as the crisis started, they didn't have any buffer to compensate for that. So instead of turning to their shareholders to ask money back, they had started to hold up their hands at the Dutch government, which sort of it was kind of contradictory, because obviously you don't want billion-dollar companies to hold up their hands, because they have rich and affluent shareholders that can do that and give money back to the company. And as a matter of fact, in the years coming up to the crisis, actually Booking.com had a lot of subsidies here in the Netherlands, amounting up to an amount of 1.7 billion euro. So in fact, the Dutch government already supported them in a big way. So that when we published that, it sort of made a bit of a controversy, and obviously a lot of the people and also politicians thought that.
But they did get the support, did they?
Well, they didn't ask for the second round. So
For the second, but the first round they received.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about European Central Bank. So because there's quite a serious amount of money going to multinationals as well from the ECB. What's going on there?
As soon as the crisis started, this is one of the articles we made, and it's basically
this is the Dutch minister who was requested by Parliament what the support was about.
The thing is with the ECB, the European Central Bank, which is the central bank of central banks in Europe, it's a very, very powerful institution, and it basically originally has a very small mandate. It needs to organize price stability within the European Union. And but with the start of the euro, the big financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and after that the European the financial crisis, the euro crisis, it sort of expanded its mandate by lengths. So there were new policies installed to start, in fact, what they call today quantitative easing. That means that basically the European Central Bank can print money by huge amounts. So far, it has printed some 2,700 billion euro, and it's 2.7 trillion euro.
Say it again. How much?
2,700 billion euro. It has been printed, printing so far. What happens with that money? The major amount of that money, bonds from countries are bought, and so that debt from countries like Italy, but also like from the Netherlands, Germany, is amounted, and banks can take that off their balances, and it's all stored up at the European Central Bank. But also, the bank buys debt from big companies. Now, that's when as soon as the Corona crisis started, obviously it was a bit of a flashback that all. The European Central Bank,
because this happened back in the 2008.
This is what I described just now happened in the euro crisis.
Right.
It was called the public sector purchase program, the 2,700 billion that belonged to that particular program. That was the euro crisis. Now we're in the Corona crisis, and now there's a new program called the pandemic emergency purchase program. Some other 750 billion euro is awarded to that program. With that, obviously, another the debt is going to be bought from European countries, but also corporate debt is going to be bought. And corporate debt is, the big European corporates like a company like LVMH, that's Louis Vuitton, Moet et Hennessy. A very big company selling, for instance, champagne. This is the owner we see here. That's Bernard Arnault, and he is the founder and owner of that huge company. And he is one of the richest men in the world, the third richest person in the world. And what the Euro ECB does, it buys debt of this company. Through the market, and with that debt, he will buy he will actually pay off his shareholders.
He will pay the dividend to shareholders.
Yeah, that's exactly what's going to happen. Yeah.
And what's how is this being argued? How is this?
In fact, the European Central Bank says it has a neutral position towards buying all that debt of corporations, and says, well, we don't look at what they sell or what they and how they operate. Also, tobacco companies are being
so the European
and oil companies, the debt is being bought. There's no particular program installed for what kind of companies are getting the funding. And there's and that is the important part, there's basically no political control on that. That was that first picture. When we published this particular story on Follow the Money, there was some upheaval. There was a number of members of Dutch Parliament that asked questions at our finance minister, and they said, "Well, why? This is economic policy. We want to have control over that." And so our Minister of Finance said, "I'm not going to check on the ECB." There he is, Wopke Hoekstra, and I'm not going to check that. Quite a fundamental part of.
And did he argue why not?
Yes, he did, and it's that same old line we've been hearing from ministers of finance all through Europe, and that is that the ECB is perfectly neutral and has a mandate, and within that mandate it operates on a neutral basis, which in fact is not true anymore.
Because he became our Dutch minister became quite controversial, also because he was blocking. He was leading the blockade against Italy, or the. But there was also an issue in the Netherlands of KLM, our Royal Dutch airline, which is getting a huge amount of support. But at least there was some pressure that KLM should reform itself also to new environmental standards.
This is exactly, there's a political issue there. So we have there's political checks and balances. And that is not the case on a European level. So we can, ECB buys huge amounts of debt of corporations, and basically we have no say whatsoever what corporations are getting that money in the end. So it can be tobacco companies, it can be oil companies, it can be a champagne company for that matter, or a lifestyle company like LVMH. And that is basically the point. It has been a very fundamental part of a public court case in Germany. And on the 5th of May, there was an important verdict came out of that court. It's the German Constitutional Court in Karlsruhe.
Yeah.
And I brought with me a scene from an interview of the president of that court, who actually on the day that he made the verdict said goodbye.
Die Kritiker, viele haben ja gesagt, dieses Urteil schadet der Rechtsgemeinschaft Europa. Wie sehen Sie das?
Wir sehen das sehr anders. Wir glauben, dass es wichtig ist, dass der Rechtsrahmen der europäischen Verträge eingehalten wird.
Okay, what the president? What the president says here that in fact the ECB is going beyond its boundaries of influence. It is a political matter, and that the German Constitutional Court is holding the ECB accountable for that. And there was a lot of protest because of this verdict. The German Constitutional Court shouldn't be involved with it, and et cetera, et cetera. We should let the ECB do whatever is necessary.
So what does that mean? That a German court has ruled this?
Yeah, well, it means that there is a big constitutional issue in Europe. Basically, what the ECB does with its measures, it does political stuff, basically, where there is no political control on it. So for instance, it funds companies. It has influence on economic policy. And you and me, as civilians, as citizens of the European Union, have no control on that. Not even politicians. We asked the control of politicians, but they don't have. Because the ECB is a completely independent institution. And that's exactly what's the case here. So what the German Constitutional Court said is we want an explanation why these measurements that have been taken so far, and we are only talking about the measurements that were taken in the euro crisis. This court case has been taking 6 years.
So we're not talking about.
We're not talking about the extra. What's going on now? It's
going to be the new case.
And the extra ruling that has been installed in March, what I just mentioned earlier, pandemic emergency purchase program, is even going a lot further than the earlier public sector purchase program.
But it doesn't help with the rather negative image Europe has already, no?
It doesn't help because actually the purchase programs are needed. We need to rescue,
of course,
countries.
That
we need
we
to rescue institutions at this point in time, and we also need to redefine basically the European Constitution and the mandate of the ECB. So the crisis brings out now we are living in quite an undemocratic European Union. That's the bottom line of this.
Let's bring in Silke and Nicolas. Maybe you want to react to what Eric has told us, has mentioned.
Yeah. I can react to that. I totally agree with that. I mean, I think one of the things, taking a really sort of bird's eye view of this, what's happening now is there's been huge economic dislocation. So there's a huge fall in government tax revenues, and yet there's a huge rise in need for spending to pay for workers who've had to stop working and all sorts of other things. So you've got a huge, massive gaps opening up between spending and revenues, which is necessary. This is what has to happen, and so you have huge deficits, budget deficits of governments. And the question is, how do we fill these budget deficits? And there is this very fundamental question. There is when a government needs money, when it has a gap between spending and revenues, it needs to borrow the difference. That's one way to get the money. And you issue a bond, which is, think of it like a piece of paper. I'm the government of France. I say, you give me $100 million and I will give you this piece of paper or this contract that says, me, the government of France, I will pay you back $100 million plus interest over 10 years, whatever. So that's how they get money now, and they have to pay it back later. There's been this hysteria in Europe, particularly intense in Germany, where I live. They call it black zero, this idea that spending and revenues must be the same, and you mustn't borrow, you mustn't have deficits, you must be, good, solid citizens. And this is a kind of mania that is a real problem now, because although there is a lot of deficit spending going on, there is going to be a reckoning later on, and we need to think very hard about what's coming next, about austerity that may be coming our way if this hysteria about not spending more than your revenues continues to it infects the whole European process. It's something that's been taught to economists for years, and particularly in Germany, and there's this obsession with it, but it is intensely problematic. So borrowing is very important, and we must allow most countries in Europe can borrow, particularly Germany. Germany is a country that the bonds that the German government is issuing are paying negative interest rates. In other words, investors are paying Germany's government money to give Germany money, to lend Germany money. And they do that because Germany is perceived as a very sort of safe investment. So they want somewhere safe to park their money. They don't want to put it in a bank account. The bank might go bust. Give it to Germany. So It's a fantastic, the interest rates are so low that borrowing has to be a huge part of this picture, and borrowing by governments. And Eric's absolutely right to make the distinction between borrowing by governments and borrowing by private companies, because there is this second way of raising money, this other way of governments raising money that can be linked to borrowing, is the central banks. The central banks can effectively create money. They can do this quantitative easing, and they can use it to buy all sorts of things. They can usually they will do it through the government. They will create the money, and then they might buy government bonds, and that is as it should be. And that is the right way forward for European countries. Some countries it's more difficult than others, and certainly developing countries find it very difficult to borrow. It's very, very hard to find investors who will lend to Angola or a country like that at the moment. But private companies, it's a different matter. Sorry, carry on.
We have to go to Silke, but that's one quick question, Eric. Though. Yeah. We always talk about the euro, the future of the euro. Are you foreseeing a euro crisis?
I foresee severe problems for the euro. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, there has been a fundamental problem with the euro as the moment it was erected, basically, and it hasn't brought us the promises that it contained. So we didn't see the economic. We haven't seen economic raise of the South, and they haven't come towards each other. In fact, they have gone out of each other. So it has created even more tension. And now you see the tension arise because we have to lend as a whole of Europe, and there needs to be a level of a high degree of solidarity, and that's now on the brink.
The opposite is happening.
Yeah. Right? It's tough.
Let's go to Silke. Welcome. You're in Zurich, right?
Yes, I'm based in Zurich, Switzerland.
You're a freelance reporter. You're a British though, and you've been German. I'm sorry.
That's why I was so happy. If you wouldn't have pointed the black zero out, Nicolas, I would have referred to that because I think it's a fairly good example to illustrate what's happening.
Hey, Silke, you've been investigating European procurement.
Yes.
Can you explain us a little bit what this entails and what's?
I said I'm freelancing since January 1st, so I don't know whether that was the most optimal time, point in time to becoming a freelancer, but I actually secured a stipend by the Association of German Science Journalists. It's called WPK, and I managed to get a lot of great colleagues on board across Europe, and together we're investigating public procurement related to the COVID-19 pandemic. I got that stipend to coordinate this consortium, where Eric is part of, and his team is part of as well. We are focusing basically on the question, or we're trying to answer the question, which government paid how much amount of money for which goods in what time frame. And we're specifically focusing on masks, all the different types of masks. Yeah, you can see them here being unloaded. I think that is a Swiss cargo flight. Well, it was a passenger flight that was reused for cargo transportation of masks to the Geneva airport directly from Shanghai. We said we're focusing on masks, on test kits, on ventilators, of course. And myself, being based in Switzerland, I focus on Switzerland and the tiny country of Liechtenstein as well. And what you've seen in that picture has become quite of a common image, I think, that countries who had the opportunity to have a national airline, they use them or they make deals with those airlines to set up air bridges to ship the goods, the PPE, the protective gear, the personal protective gear directly from China to the country where they are bought from. And in that case, it was a plane from Shanghai to Geneva. For the very reason, countries got scared that if the plane is not going directly to their country, they would be stopped and the goods could be confiscated. That has happened. And that is, I think, a very, very bad sign of the mechanism that has occurred, especially during the first weeks and months of the COVID-19 pandemic, when countries not stood up and managed to secure a joint procurement procedure, but to be in competition with each other.
Because can you I mean, we are in the Netherlands here, and in the Netherlands we were told up till basically yesterday that it didn't make any sense to wear masks, face masks.
Oh wow!
Yesterday, the rules they changed the rules, so now we have the bars and cafes, the restaurants are reopened, but in public transport we have to wear face masks suddenly. So I think there's a lot of confusion, at least here in the Netherlands. Is this because it's true that we don't need to wear them? Or were there other reasons behind it?
Well, to come up with a final conclusion, I don't think we'll ever get to that point. I mean, fact is there are different scientific studies out there proving different results. What we notice now, working so closely together with all those colleagues across Europe, every country has its very own solution. For example, now you say you're supposed to wear a mask in public transportation. In Switzerland, that is not mandatory. Whether that is because there is a lack of masks, I'm pretty confident that we will not be able to prove this direct connection eventually. What we're trying to prove is actually to show the market mechanism, to shed light on public procurement in a state of emergency. Fast buying, I think that is something that we conclude for a fact. Some fast buying is sort of opens up the possibility for fraud, and that we know. I don't think that we know the extent of the fraud yet, and we don't know the fraudsters by name yet. But those are the ones that we're looking into. And of course, the rather large question of why was it not possible to set up a joint procurement from the very beginning of the crisis, at least on EU level. Now, Switzerland is not a member of the EU, but we have bilateral agreements. So why not join forces in times of crisis? Why did that not work out? And that is something we're trying to dig into as well.
Did you get an answer into that?
We're digging into that, and we're getting answers, but for now they're all off the record. Nobody wants to speak up yet. Because so let's see where that leads us in the course of the investigation.
Because, did you see similarities between the different EU countries, or was it really everyone on its own? From the very beginning, it seemed to be a bit everyone of its own. Simply Switzerland, for example, and Switzerland is bordering to Italy. We simply did not comprehend what was going on in the country, which is our southern neighbor. And obviously, Italy needed to react faster than Switzerland did, for example. It was far worse hit. It's a far larger country. In comparison to Switzerland, we as such we're tiny, but we're a rich country, and that means we're purchasing power. So Switzerland was able to come up with a very efficient way of public procurement, more efficient than, for example, Germany. Yeah, there you go. This is the main coordinator that you say. He is a trained lawyer, and he got recruited by the army. Mr. Neff, to actually head the army pharmacy in Switzerland. And they were then responsible on national level to pile in stocks of masks, test kits, protective gear, ventilators, anything that you could think of. So that made it quite easy for Switzerland, but we notice... But a very small population as well, right?
Yes, a small country, a rich country. We have purchasing power. We have this cliche of Swiss efficiency. In this case, this might be even true. And then, as said, in comparison to other countries, it's a fairly good position. We have seen, for example, that Lithuania has spent an enormous amount of money per unit, per mask, simply because they were had a disadvantaged position.
But it seems...
So that's the dirty market mechanism that took place, and it's not privately held companies that do compete against each other, but it's countries.
Because it seems that hardly any EU country was prepared for a pandemic like this, or
yes.
Was there any exception to the rule?
Not that we know of, and experts and sources that we talk to, they expected countries to be far better prepared, especially with crises such as Ebola and SARS has happened in the past. So it apparently took many countries across Europe by surprise, and that again took experts that we talked to by surprise.
Because I mean, that obviously the weird situation was that China was probably the main provider of face masks. How do you view the cooperation between the EU and China in this respect?
I can't
in the whole procurement.
Yeah, I can share maybe one info we got from a Swiss source that I spoke to that I found quite interesting. He described it as such. In the midst of the pandemic, they had 1 week where they really weren't sure whether the prices will ever go down. We're talking a price gouge of up to 400%. And that person said it was basically the Chinese government that eventually started to regulate access to the market for suppliers. And he used this as an argument that prices eventually slowly decreased. So prices are not there where they have been before COVID-19, definitely not. But eventually they decreased and made it not cheaper. There's still a lot of money involved, but it made it easier for countries to identify suitable suppliers, to buy for a reasonable amount of money. And and as I said, it's not only about the price, it's also about the quality. So this is something that we've discovered as well. Countries have bought fraudulent equipment. And then the big question, and that hasn't been solved either, is who's eventually gonna pay for the fraudulent equipment, whether it's fraudulent masks or a fraudulent ventilator. And that we've seen in Denmark, where a huge amount of money has been spent on masks that are not usable. And they need to be destroyed eventually because they will harm the person that wears it, but also the person in the surroundings. So that's something we haven't found a solution either, and that is something that needs to be solved eventually, right?
But you're talking about very bad quality. That's the reason.
Yes. It's right. The one thing is the first step was, I think, for countries to get out of the market and do sort of panic shopping to get as much equipment in as they could. Then countries discovered, well, look, we're willing to pay a reasonable high price, but they didn't test it, or they simply didn't think of that they could buy fraudulent equipment. And now this fraudulent equipment is being delivered. And the question is now what we're going to do with that. Who's going to be held responsible for that eventually?
So Silke, we have a question. Do you think Europe should take a more central role in distributing the vital goods necessary in times of crises like this? To prevent inequalities of European countries, or prices which go through the roof. Are we learning anything from this?
Well, hopefully we'll do. Scholars now already argue for a joint procurement approach, and that has been far too late in the process that the European Commission eventually kicked off a joint procurement. This is now the case, but it's far too late. And as said, and also scholars and scientists argue this could have been done. Every country has a pandemic plan somewhere written down. There is an EU authority who gathers this information. The thing is, nobody looked at that. But that should have been done in the first place. So damage is done. Question is what to learn from the COVID-19 pandemic, and that would definitely be to go for a joint procurement in terms of equality, but also in terms of developing a purchasing power in the market.
Well, when is your investigation? When are you planning to publish?
We don't have a fixed date yet, but we will do a series of publications focusing on public spending, of course, but also on the question of quality. and fraudulent equipment.
And where will we'll be able to see it?
Well, in the Netherlands, on Follow the Money,
okay.
obviously, because the team has joined us. And then we have at least one media partner per country. And when I say per country, we basically cover the whole of Europe, so not only the EU. We're missing Monaco, Andorra, but that is for the very simple reason that we're not well connected to those countries. So we focus on Europe, and I'll guess we will be heard.
I hope so. Well, we're looking forward to find your the conclusions.
Yeah.
So I guess you too, Eric.
Well, certainly. Well, I mean, this is an interesting investigation because you see big differences within Europe on the way how governments are transparent and controllable. In the Netherlands, we are falling way beyond, way back, because we are our government is not transparent at all about these procurement issues. And we don't get the information. So there again, you find in times of crisis, there's a lack of democratic transparency, which is worrisome.
Because how do you read what I mean? What I was just saying, that the Dutch up till yesterday didn't have to wear any masks, and now suddenly in public transport we have.
Yeah, I have one as well. Otherwise, I can't cross the river here and get to my office. But indeed, it has. You see that all over Europe. There isn't a general, fixed lines of what strategies.
But was it connected to the market and the shortages?
Well, not. We've tried to procure from especially the face masks already for weeks and weeks already. But not only face masks, it's also the testing equipment. It's like what Silke already said, the respiratory equipment, the ventilators. That have been a big issue, especially in the start, because when the curve was on the rise and all the ICs were filled with people, we had no machines to put them on to breathe, which is a bit of a problem if it's because it's a lung disease, obviously, COVID-19. So the procurement already started right at the beginning. However, we already knew in January that this crisis was coming, and we reacted too late, and we did not act in a proper way, and especially did not cooperate and not as we were not as fast and as the Swiss were, for instance. We didn't put the money on the table when we needed to.
Because Silke, I mean, the next stage is obviously what's going to happen with the vaccine. If there's any central.
Yeah. I mean, we just picked to make it sort of manageable for us as investigative reporters. We picked this approach of focusing on very specific PPE, personal protective equipment, and we didn't go that far to focus on who is now the fastest to develop a vaccine. We deliberately chose not to. But of course, that's a question. Staying now within the range of our investigation, the question would also be is who is going to audit whom? Because there will be audits, at least on national level, and probably on EU level as well. And the question is how fast we'll see findings there, and how transparent they're going to be made public. Because as Eric, you rightly said that the one big thing we're fighting in each country is in transparency. And that is because government officials and authorities just refer to a current state of emergency, meaning that it is very easier for them to block off investigative reporters. So that will be part of our investigation, and I think that needs to be part of a recap of what has happened during the first half year of 2020. This has to be investigated as well.
I very much agree with that. So, I mean, the lack of transparency is a big issue. So, and it has the democratic issues here on the table.
Yeah.
Because let's go to Nicholas. You're an author and an investigative journalist, reporter. You actually wrote recently that the COVID-19 pandemic is striking rich countries the hardest, which to me was a bit of a surprise to read that.
No, when I wrote that was a little while ago. That was only because the disease itself had got to the rich countries, seemed to have got to the rich countries first. It wasn't a judgment on who was going to pay the highest economic cost. I think, as always, it's always in giant crises. You will always get the most vulnerable people being hit the hardest, and that includes the most vulnerable people in our own societies. It includes poorer countries and particularly the most vulnerable people in those countries. It's hard to know. I mean, Africa, for example, it's hard to know how deeply the pandemic itself has struck because data is not so clear. So we don't, the data isn't so good there yet. So we don't know how far the disease itself is striking poorer countries, but I suspect it will be very terrible. I know, in some countries, Brazil, there is quite a lot of data and things are looking pretty terrible there. But at the time I wrote that, which was a few weeks ago, the disease itself had struck rich countries the hardest. Yeah. But I think it's important to kind of bring this into context of what's happening now in terms of, if we're talking about rich countries, what's happening now is protests, unrest, particularly in the United States. And I think that has got many causes, but I think the underlying economic conditions that we've been seeing in the United States are also conditions that we see in Europe. And I think what's happening in the United States could be coming our way, because at the moment governments are kind of in a position to, they have been borrowing money and spending it and keeping workers in jobs. But what's going to happen in a year's time if this crisis, if lots of people remain unemployed? There's going to be some really serious questions to answer. There's been a lot of criticism of, the protesters and looters and so on in the United States. There's a very funny satirical magazine called The Onion, which did a story recently saying, how dare these protesters start their looting process without forming a private equity company first. And the idea is private equity companies is something I've studied a lot, and I wrote quite a bit about it in my last book. Essentially, they are what you might call wealth extractors. They do many things, private equity firms, but the sort of core thing that makes them different from other firms is they go and buy up companies. And usually these are perfectly healthy companies with good cash flows and stuff. And then they start the financial engineering. So they say, this company hasn't run its financial affairs through tax havens enough. Let's do that. Let's get some accountants in and extract some money from the taxpayers. This company is paying its workers too much. It's paying too much into its pension system. Let's break the unions. Let's extract more money from the workers. This country is giving its suppliers too generous terms. Let's extract money from the suppliers. This company, let's buy a bunch of similar companies in this market niche, and then we've got a monopoly, and then we can extract money from consumers. So it's kind of looking at all the different stakeholders of these companies and extracting wealth and paying themselves huge dividends. At the same time as they're doing this, they're also loading this company up with huge amounts of debt. So they're getting the underlying company to borrow a lot of money, and then they take the proceeds of that borrowing and pay it to themselves. So you have this fragile company underneath them. And if it goes bankrupt, the owners, the people who are extracting all this money, aren't on the hook because they're using limited liability and other tricks to shield themselves from all that damage.
Nicholas,
what's going on in the economy is something that academics call financialization. But basically what this is a process where financial techniques, financial institutions like private equity firms or investment funds or whatever, are kind of inserting themselves into the real economy. And by the real economy, I mean, just the stuff we're familiar with, supermarkets, agriculture, telecommunications, airlines, whatever you want to think about. Increasingly, financial players are coming in and buying them up and sort of re-engineering them to extract money on behalf of ultimately a small group of people. And so what we've got here, if we're going to be paying for the looking to where are we going to find the money for these gigantic economic costs that are coming our way. One of the most straightforward things, I mean, it's not technically straightforward, but politically it is straightforward, is to see this extraction going on, see that, there's a productive economy and then there's a sort of financial economy on top of it extracting wealth.
But Nicholas, can I ask you a question, what you said earlier? Because, we from Europe, we look at the US, where, I don't know, it's 25% of the working population is unemployed. Maybe it's even higher now. We kind of look in amazement at those numbers. Is this going to happen in Europe as well? I mean, we cannot generalize really, but...
Yeah, I hate making forecasts, particularly about the future, as I think it was one of the Marx brothers said, or Yogi Berra. I don't want to make any predictions. I think it depends a lot on... I think we face now very serious risks. I think we could be heading to very, very high rates of unemployment, very high rates of social unrest. And this provides fertile grounds for all sorts of political movements and stuff. And there's kind of two ways it could go now. I think, people are up in arms, people are anxious, people are angry, and this is a real serious crisis. And the difference with the last global financial crisis is back then there was a kind of whole consensus that everything was fine, that these economic policies that governments were enacting that included all this financialization, they were fine, it was working. And then when the crisis happening, there were no alternatives out there that were kind of credible. I think since then, we've had a lot of people constructing all sorts of new ways of looking at this. Let's re-engineer our economies. Let's have some really radical solutions. So there are all these really radical solutions, progressive solutions, which could be very effective and could be very helpful. So that's one way we could go. We could, this could be a way for us to heal ourselves, to heal our economies, to heal the very terrible kind of economic structures and structural inequalities that are in our societies. Of course, the other way, as we all know, is the kind of the drift towards fascism, the drift towards authoritarianism, the drift towards the kind of dystopias that we're seeing emerging even in countries like the United States, where it's kind of historically it's been seen as the great bastion of democracy, and that's all being undermined. So, I don't want to predict which way we're going to go. I hope we go a way that helps the broad number of populations and starts really seriously addressing these inequalities of billionaires, this oligarchic power that's emerged over the last few decades. And let's try and take that opportunity to try and fight back against that, because the alternative is potentially very terrible.
Because you're a tax investigator as well, so obviously, like countries like the Netherlands, they're quite big support packages for either companies, as we were talking earlier to Eric, but also for people. Especially Germany has been standing out. If we really run into this crisis, this depression, what's going to happen with these taxes and tax evasion?
Yeah, so this is one of the important things. I mean, we must be very careful with tax now, because we must not damage the weak. The small businesses that are about to go out of business, poor people, people who lost their jobs. We must be very careful that taxes must not damage these people, and try and rebuild and try and recover. On the other hand, there are a lot of players out there who are very strong indeed. There's companies, we're talking on Zoom right now. I mean, Zoom communications has been done very well out of this pandemic. And Amazon is going to continue to do very well. This gigantic monopolist. And so we need to effectively look at the structure of our tax systems. We don't want to balance our budgets at this point. We don't want to say we must raise more taxes, because then we're going to kind of damage any economic recovery we might have. But we must look at the structure of tax system, who is paying. And the central principle we must use in our tax system is, now the strong must step in and help support the weak. The rich must help support the poor. And that is something that has been a problem for a long time, but we haven't had the political will until now to do something about it. I think now is our moment to really start going for this. So we need to look at really radical solutions, and we need to do things like excess profit, very high excess profit taxes on multinational corporations. When they earn very, very high profits, we should tax them at, in the First and Second World Wars, lots of countries had these taxes, and they were taxing corporations at rates of 80, 90, even 100%. And we should start looking at really radical things like that now. The beauty of an excess profits tax is it doesn't, you earn a certain amount of profits and you don't get taxed anything. So small and weak companies will pay nothing. But very profitable companies, including companies that have done very well out of the pandemic, you start levying very, very high rates of tax on them. So in order to try and protect the tax system as best you can.
If we listen to Eric, the opposite is happening.
Indeed. So I think it's quite, we can hope that, when we must count on the end that strong government will, take measures in order, to tax capital instead of tax labor, which is basically the case. So that, most of the tax is being funded by ordinary people, really, and not by the affluent companies, people earning huge dividends from the profits from companies, big companies. So that should be turned around, but that you need the political will to do that. That's first of all. And at this point in time, we see that the help programs, as I pointed out, that the support from the ECB is also going into directions of these huge companies that can borrow at 0%, and which contradicts a lot with the small businesses and that cannot borrow for 0%. I can tell you that, if they can get a loan from a bank in anyway. So but there's a huge gap between that. The inequality is rising.
Is there any country who understand this necessity, Nicholas?
I think we are at the beginning of a long process. I think right now, Eric's absolutely right. The kind of old mentality is still in place, but there is a groundswell building up. And I think in 2 years' time, if we revisit this, I think we will see a real shift in political will. Whether anything's being actually done yet in that respect is... I don't know, but in 5 years' time, I would imagine there's going to be a real sort of there's a real potential for this sort of will-o'-the-wisp thing, political will, really kind of changing and becoming something that allows us to do something that we haven't been able to do for literally decades. Some countries, the last global financial crisis, what country did best in sort of bringing the bankers to book? I don't know, maybe Iceland. Iceland's quite a good example of a place that had this enormous pre-crisis boom and bust. And then it, when things went bad, they really did, they threw bankers in jail and stuff like that. In Britain, nothing like that happened. In Britain, there's this, bankers are like a protected species. The city of London is so powerful and so influential in Britain. And I think in Britain, it's quite hard at the moment to imagine being able to do anything about what's going on. The Bank of England is completely captured. It's even worse than the ECB, I think, in terms of protecting capital.
It's the whole financial system in Europe is intertwined with each other. And governments are depending on banks, and they have to support the banks again when they get into trouble. And the banks organize the money system and so forth. Yeah. So we are so much as nations, resting on the shoulders of financial institutions that we have to break that up, basically to make it more independent, to give the power back to the people, basically.
But that's what a lot of people said after the financial crisis, no?
I hope this crisis will definitely open that window of opportunity that, like Nicholas says, that, we finally get some real changes going. We've learned from the last crisis.
But what makes this one different?
Well, I think probably we already know that this crisis is going to be worse than the crisis of 2008 and 2009. We see the economic downturn will be bigger and the impact will be heavier. So we have a bigger crisis at our hands. So we need to transform. We need to totally change that system in order to be more to be prepared for the future, basically.
Nicholas, we have a question coming in. The Netherlands are being known for being a tax haven, although the Dutch government will deny this, for wealthy corporations. Could the Netherlands take an active part to prevent those companies from being bought from by private companies that are only focused on avoiding more taxes and take away money from customers?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, the Netherlands is a corporate tax haven. One of my sort of informal markers of tax havens, I mean, I watch tax havens very carefully, is if they strenuously deny being a tax haven, then they certainly are a tax haven. They all deny it. We're not a tax haven. Somebody else is a tax haven. The Netherlands is a corporate tax haven. It's not a particularly secretive place. There's lots of different kind of ways of defining tax havens. But in terms of helping large multinational corporations escape tax, Netherlands is one of the big 5 or 6, along with Ireland and Bermuda and Luxembourg and Singapore. So first of all, Netherlands emphatically is a tax haven. Can the Netherlands be part of a solution? I think one of the differences between the Netherlands and somewhere like the British Virgin Islands or Bermuda is that those are tiny little places with tiny little democratic, sort of quasi-democratic systems where the power of capital of multinational corporations is so immense that it's politically impossible to imagine breaking open that consensus, no matter what happens. I mean, Bermuda, for example, Bermuda on paper is one of the richest countries in the world, but there's actually terrible poverty there. But those people are completely, I've been, talking to people in and around Bermuda for the last little while, and it's really a place that the poverty is shocking. There's a lot of rich people as well. So in those places, it's very hard to imagine something really real being done. The Netherlands, by contrast, is a democracy. It's a real democracy. And there is a fight, between, I think a lot of people in the Netherlands don't want this stuff. They don't like being a tax haven. They don't like helping large multinationals. They're worried about inequality. They're worried about the erosion of democracy and unaccountable oligarchical elites. So there's the potential for a real fight. I think the Dutch government at the moment is rather captured, and there is still a fairly large consensus that says, oh, we mustn't, these multinationals that are sort of shuffling profits through our country, we mustn't touch them. It could, harm our economy. But ultimately, when you're talking about all this corporate profits coming through tax haven activity, they don't really bring very much to the country itself. They hardly touch the sides, because if you tax them too much, they'll run away. So you don't get much tax revenues. You employ a few accountants. And you can also do, there's various kinds of damage that can come from this sort of stuff. So whether this stuff is even benefiting the Netherlands, the population of the Netherlands as a whole, is another question entirely. So I think there is a possibility there with, education in the Netherlands, people waking up to the fact that it is a problematic, it's a very problematic area to be in this corporate tax haven game. And large numbers of people hate it inside and outside the Netherlands. I think there is the possibility over time, in the coming years of real change happening. But it won't be easy.
And Silke, how, if you look from a Swiss perspective?
Mm-hmm. Well, Nicholas, you mentioned the endangered species of bankers. That accounts for the city of London as much as it does for Geneva and Zurich. I like the idea of the radical idea that you mentioned, or radical ideas. And I do think it's time now to bring that to the table, and from a journalistic perspective, at least offer the opportunity to a room for debate in the newspaper, in an evening talk show on the public broadcaster, whether it's TV or radio. I think that is something that we also can foster, besides investigating and pointing out those loopholes. And myself, I've been investigating tax loopholes, and when it comes to larger global companies, not only such as Amazon, Google, Facebook, but something that probably every one of us uses in an everyday life, which is Uber. We have pointed that out, and we should continue to do so. But now with a specific focus also on those last 3 months of severe crisis. And again, I think the combination of room for debate and delivering results through investigating misconduct, even corruption, tax evasion, if some might call it, that is the way to go forward. And it of course, and I'm coming back to the title of today's event, that is not easy in times of isolation. But I think most of investigative reporters have found a good way to move forward and not getting stuck back home in isolation. And I would strongly argue and support that we should go forward.
Okay. I'm afraid we have to leave it here, and we could do another hour, I'm sure.
Easily.
But I do want to thank you all for being here. I would like to thank my audience for watching. Next week, we will be back with another edition of Emerging Stories. We will focus more on the whole issue of privacy and what should happen and not should happen. There's a lot of speak about corona apps and where governments succeed or fail, and where a public is a victim or actually winning the case. One of my guests will be, among others, Nigat Dat from Pakistan, and the two others will be announced tomorrow. Thank you again for watching, and hope to see you next week, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye for now.